Apologize to my wife or die alone, my son said. So I disappeared before sunrise. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a man being humiliated in front of people who were never going to defend him anyway. I learned that silence on a Thanksgiving night in Ohio, in a dining room, with a chandelier that cost more than my first truck. When my daughter-in-law's father picked up the gift I had carved for my granddaughter, looked at it the way you look at something you've stepped in, and dropped it into a wastebasket without breaking eye contact with me. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I finished my water, folded my napkin, and walked out into the cold. 3 weeks later, my son called me from a gas station outside Columbus and told me I had two choices: apologize to Vanessa's family for embarrassing them at their own table, or accept that I would be spending every holiday for the rest of my life alone. I chose a third option. But before I tell you what that was, I need you to understand how I got to that dining room in the first place. Because a man doesn't end up disappearing before sunrise over one bad dinner. He ends up there over 3 years of small, quiet erasures that finally added up to something he couldn't carry anymore. My name is Walter Hensley. I am 66 years old. I spent 41 years as a master carpenter and later a licensed general contractor in the town of Marion, Ohio, building barns, additions, and eventually whole houses for families who trusted me because my word had never once needed a lawyer behind it. My wife, Margaret, died of ovarian cancer in the spring, 3 years before the night I'm telling you about. We had been married 39 years. She used to say that a house isn't the boards and the nails, it's the decisions you make inside it, and I believed her the way I believed the sun would rise, without needing proof. My son, Ethan, was 33 that Thanksgiving. He'd married Vanessa Colton 2 years earlier, a smart, ambitious woman from a family that had done very well in commercial real estate development around Columbus. Her father, Richard Colton, ran Colton Development Group, a firm that built shopping plazas and mixed-use towers with his name on the sign, out front, in letters taller than a man. Her mother, Diane Colton, ran the house, the way Richard ran his job sites, efficiently, and with very clear ideas about who belonged where. I had met them exactly 4 times before that Thanksgiving. Each time, I had felt the particular chill of being appraised and found insufficient, though nothing was ever said outright. Richard shook my hand like he was checking a level for plum. Diane asked me, the first time we met, whether I had kept up the trade or moved into something more, let's say, stable, in a tone that made it clear which answer she was hoping for. I had a granddaughter by then, Nora, 7 years old, born the same autumn Margaret's diagnosis came in, which meant Margaret had gotten 14 months with her before the cancer took the rest of the time we thought we had. Nora had Margaret's laugh, the same sudden, complete kind that arrived without warning and took over her whole small body. I had been carving things for her since she was 2, a rattle, then blocks, then a small rocking chair for her dolls that took me 4 months because I refused to rush the joinery. That Thanksgiving, I had spent 6 weeks on a music box. Cherry wood, hand-turned mechanism I'd ordered from a specialty supplier in Vermont, the lid carved with a pattern of oak leaves, because Nora loved the big oak tree in our old backyard on Delaware Avenue, the one Margaret used to paint from the kitchen window. Inside it played Clair de Lune, slow and simple, the only tune the mechanism could manage, but a good one. I had wrapped it in a square of the same blue felt Margaret used to line her sewing box with. It was, without question, the finest thing I had ever made for a child. The dinner was held at the Colton House in Upper Arlington, a stone Tudor with a circular drive and topiary shaped into spheres so exact they looked machined rather than grown. I arrived at 6 on time, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought for Ethan's wedding 2 years before, carrying the music box in both hands like it might break from a hard look. Deanne opened the door herself. She smiled the particular smile of a woman greeting a caterer she suspects is running late. Walter. How prompt. She glanced past me toward the drive, as if checking whether I'd arrived in something appropriate, and I understood immediately that my 10-year-old sedan had already been noted and filed. Inside, the house smelled like roasting turkey and candle wax, and something with cinnamon that had clearly been purchased rather than baked. Through the archway into the main dining room, I could see the long table set for 14, china that caught the chandelier light, a runner of gold and burgundy silk. Richard stood near the fireplace, in conversation with two men I didn't recognize. Business partners, perhaps. The kind of men who laughed at the correct moments without appearing to actually be listening. "The main table's rather full this evening," Diane said, touching my elbow the way you'd steer a delivery man toward the service entrance. "We've got the Whitfields and the Marchettis joining us, Richard's business associates, and the seating's been arranged around some professional conversation that needs to happen tonight. We've set you up somewhere a little quieter. I hope that's all right." It was not a question, so I didn't answer it as one. The quieter place was a card table set up near the swinging door to the kitchen, one folding chair, a single water glass already filled. I sat down. I set the music box on the chair beside me, the way you'd protect a thing you weren't sure would survive the evening otherwise, and I looked across the room at my son. Ethan stood near Vanessa by the bay window, laughing at something Richard had said, his hand resting at the small of his wife's back. Our eyes met for exactly as long as it takes a man to decide not to see something. Then he turned back to the conversation. And I understood, in the specific, quiet way you understand things you've been avoiding for a long time, that I had become an inconvenience my son had learned to manage, rather than a father he was willing to defend. I ate my dinner from a folding chair. I watched the party breathe and move around me, indifferent, the way a party does when it has already decided who matters in the room. And I thought about the kitchen table on Delaware Avenue, where Ethan had done his homework for 12 years, where Margaret used to set down a glass of milk without being asked, because she understood that some kinds of love are quietest when they're most certain. Then I heard small feet running, and Nora came around the corner of the buffet table like a declaration, cheeks flushed, hair coming loose from whatever careful arrangement it had started the evening in, a small plastic recorder clutched in one fist. "Grandpa Walter, I found you." "You always do," I said, and she threw her arms around my neck with the whole body commitment only children still manage, and something in my chest that had been clenched all evening loosened, just for a moment, just enough. She climbed into the chair across from me, set the little red recorder on the table with the seriousness of a scientist calibrating an instrument, and told me, without pausing for breath, that Mrs. Alvarez, her second-grade teacher, said every good reporter had to keep their recorder ready because you never knew when something important might happen. She had already recorded the turkey going into the oven, her mother arguing with a delivery driver about a wrong order, and, she told me proudly, the sound of my car pulling into the driveway because she could tell it apart from all the others now. "You're a very observant reporter," I told her. "Mrs. Alvarez says that's the most important thing." She picked up my water glass and studied her upside-down reflection in it with total concentration. Then she looked up. "Grandpa, can I show you something I found?" She reached into the little quilted bag she carried everywhere and pulled out a photograph, worn soft at the corners, the way photographs get when a child has carried them around and looked at them too many times to count. It was Margaret, in our old backyard, mid-law, hand raised to block the sun, the oak tree behind her heavy with July leaves. "I keep it in my bag," Nora said, "so Grandma Margaret can come to things too." My throat did something I was not prepared for at a folding table beside a swinging kitchen door. I pressed the back of my thumb to the corner of my eye, quick, before it could become anything more than what it was. "She'd be very glad to know that," I said. "I miss her," Nora said, quiet now, serious in the particular way children get when they're testing whether an adult will take the feeling seriously. "Even though I don't remember her that much. Is that okay?" "Missing someone isn't about how much you remember," I told her. "It's about what they left behind in you. And your grandmother left a great deal in this world, Nora. In you especially." She nodded, satisfied. The way children accept truths that adults spend years failing to believe, and set the photograph carefully on the table between us, propped against the sugar bowl, angled so Margaret could, in whatever way mattered to a 7-year-old, see the room. I was watching Nora study the photograph when I became aware of footsteps behind me, not the quick, apologetic rhythm of catering staff. Slower, heavier. The particular gait of a man who has never once questioned whether a room belonged to him. Richard stopped at the edge of the card table and looked down at the photograph the way he looked at most things that weren't his, with the brief, dismissive attention of a man cataloging what required removal. "What is this doing out here?" he said. It wasn't a question, it had the shape of one, but none of the weight. "That's Grandma Margaret," Nora said, chin lifting. "This isn't the place for personal items at a dinner table, Mr. Hensley." Richard reached past his granddaughter and picked up the photograph with 2 fingers, the way you'd handle something you weren't certain was clean, and turned toward a passing server carrying a tray of used glassware. "Take this to the kitchen, please." The server, young, tired, halfway through a 12-hour shift, took the photograph without registering what it was, and disappeared through the swinging door. It was gone before I could stand. Nora's mouth opened. Her whole small body went rigid the way a child's body does when something happens too fast and too wrong for her to process yet. Her eyes filled, and she turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. The particular devastation of a child discovering that adults are capable of things she didn't know were allowed. I pressed both hands flat against the table, feeling the cloth, focusing on the texture of it, because whatever was moving through my chest in that moment needed somewhere to go that wasn't my face, not in front of her. "Grandpa, I'm sorry," Nora whispered. "I shouldn't have. That was not your fault," I said, pulling her into my side. "Not one part of it." Richard had already turned away, already moving back toward the fireplace, back toward the room that was his, when his eyes landed on the music box sitting on the chair beside me. He picked it up before I could stop him, turned it over once in his hands, the way you'd inspect something at a yard sale you had no intention of buying. "You carved this?" His voice had the flatness of a verdict already reached. 6 weeks, I said. "For Nora, she has an entire shelf of imported music boxes from Vienna. Educational, hand-finished, certified non-toxic." He turned it again, ran his thumb along the oak leaf carving with something close to distaste. "This looks like something off a job site." "The edges are sanded to 220, I said. "I've been working wood for 41 years. He looked at me over the box with an expression that made very clear his opinion of 41 years spent working wood, and then he dropped it. Not set it down, dropped it into the decorative wastebasket beside the fireplace hearth, 6 feet away, without checking where it landed. The sound it made was small and final. Nora made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life, and I stood up from the folding chair, not fast, not shaking, the way a man stands up from a piece of finished work. "I have built things in this state for 4 decades, Mr. Colton," I said. "Barns, houses, additions people raised entire families inside. I have never once, in all that time, watched a man throw away a child's gift in front of her face and call it hospitality." Richard opened his mouth. I did not wait to hear what came out of it. I picked up my coat from the back of the folding chair, and I walked toward the front door, past the long table, past the chandelier light, past my son, who had turned at the sound and was watching me now with an expression I could not read and did not stay to interpret. Behind me, I heard Nora's voice, high and furious in a way I had never heard from her before, saying something to her grandfather that I couldn't make out over the sound of my own footsteps. And then I heard something else, a small mechanical click, familiar, the kind of sound a plastic recorder makes when a determined 7-year-old presses the button one more time, before shoving it deep into her cardigan pocket. I did not know it yet, standing on that circular drive in the November cold, breath fogging in front of me, coat only half on. But that small red recorder, still running, tucked against the ribs of a furious, grieving 7-year-old girl, was about to become the most important tool I had ever owned. More important than any level, any square, any tape measure I had carried across 41 years of job sites. It was about to catch, word for word, the exact shape of the lie my son's new family had been building for 2 years, and hand it to me on the one night I was ready to hear it. The cold outside hit me the way it always does in Ohio in November. Honest, immediate, uninterested in what had just happened inside. I stood on the drive for a moment, breathing it in, and I heard the front door open behind me and quick footsteps on the stone steps. And I knew before I turned around that it was not going to be Richard coming after me. It was Ethan. Dad. He caught up to me at the edge of the drive, his own coat unbuttoned, his face doing something complicated in the porch light, somewhere between apology and irritation, as if he hadn't yet decided which one he was more entitled to. You can't just walk out of there. I can, I said. I did. Do you understand what you just did in there? His voice dropped, urgent the way it used to when he was 16 and had wrecked the truck and needed to explain it before I found out on my own. Richard's furious. Diane's furious. This is Vanessa's family, Dad, and I have spent 2 years learning how to exist in their world, what to say, what never to say, and you just— He threw away a photograph of your mother, I said. And then he threw away a music box I spent 6 weeks carving for your daughter. In front of her. It was a toy, Dad. Ethan pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead, a gesture so exactly like his mother's that my chest tightened sharply. You made it into this enormous thing, and now I'm the one who has to smooth it over. I'm always the one who has to smooth it over. I looked at my son, 33 years old, standing in a driveway on Thanksgiving night with his coat hanging open, and underneath the anger, something else, something closer to fear, though I couldn't yet say fear of what. I didn't make it into anything, I said. I said out loud what was already true. There's a difference, Ethan, and you used to know it. He stared at me for a long moment, then his spine straightened, the way it does when a man has decided to say a thing he's been building toward for a while and no longer wants to hold on to it. You have 2 choices, Dad. His voice had gone level now, rehearsed. You call Richard tomorrow and you apologize, really apologize, not the version where the words are right, but your whole face says something else. You do that and we move past this, or you don't, and you can spend every holiday for the rest of your life exactly the way you spent tonight. Alone, the porch light caught the side of his face, and for just a moment I saw Margaret in the line of his jaw, in the stubborn set of his mouth, and I looked for more of her and did not find enough. When was the last time you apologized to me? I asked. He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. Happy Thanksgiving, son, I said, and I got in my car, and I drove the 40 minutes back to the house on Delaware Avenue with the heat off, because I wanted to feel something honest on the way home, and somewhere past the second stoplight in town, I began to think, for the first time, about a third option. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it that afternoon, and that was the hardest part. Not the quiet. 3 years of widowhood had taught me exactly where the quiet lived, which rooms it gathered in, how it changed texture between morning and evening. The hardest part was that nothing about the house had changed, and I had just come from an evening that had changed something in me I couldn't yet name, and the 2 facts sat side by side without resolving into anything. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, the same kid had lived on for 30 years, and I was halfway to the kitchen when something small and hard shifted against my ribs. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out Nora's red plastic recorder. She must have slipped it into my pocket during the hug at the door, the one she'd given me before Diane called her upstairs for something. I turned it over in my hands. The little light on the side was dark, meaning either the battery had died or it had simply stopped recording at some point in the evening. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure you're ready to open. Then I pressed play. The first sounds were the ones I expected. The muffled ambient hum of the party from inside my jacket pocket, crystal and conversation, the faint strings of whatever playlist Diane had chosen for the evening. I heard myself talking to Nora about her grandmother. I heard my own voice say, missing someone isn't about how much you remember. I pressed my thumb hard against the edge of the table and kept listening. The recording had kept running long after I left the table, through the moment Richard dropped the music box, through my walk to the door, through the cold outside. And somewhere close to 40 minutes in, muffled by fabric but unmistakable, 2 voices I recognized began speaking in what they clearly believed was a private corner of a very large house. Richard's voice first, lower than his public voice, clipped and businesslike. The LLC paperwork went through in October. Hensley Construction dissolved into Colton Hensley Development, signatures on the amendment. Diane's voice, unhurried, the tone of a woman confirming a grocery list. And he doesn't know. He doesn't need to know until the Delaware Avenue parcel clears title. Once that's done, the bank uses the new entity for the loan, not his name. A pause. The sound of a glass being set down. And Ethan? Ethan knows what he needs to know. I stopped the recording. I sat at my kitchen table in the house on Delaware Avenue on Thanksgiving night, and I looked at the watercolor Margaret had painted of our backyard oak tree, the one hanging crooked on the wall by the refrigerator because I'd never quite gotten the level right when I hung it, and I breathed in and out slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to breathe on a job site, when something structural had failed and panic was the one thing guaranteed to make it worse. My hands were flat on the table. Steady. 41 years of tool handles had put a permanent callus in my right palm, and the knuckle on that same hand had healed slightly crooked since a framing accident in 1991. These hands had built things, solid things, still standing. They were not shaking now. I got up, went to the phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called after midnight in years. "Frank," I said, when the groggy voice answered, "I need you to come by in the morning. Bring the number for that attorney you used on the Kessler dispute." A pause on the other end, the sound of a man coming fully awake in real time. How bad? I looked at the little red recorder sitting on my kitchen table, still faintly warm in the way that plastic gets when it's been held against a body for hours. "Bad enough that I'm glad I found out tonight," I said, "instead of 6 months from now." Outside, the first snow of the season had started, coming down soft and steady past the porch light, entirely indifferent to what had just changed inside that house. I did not go to bed. I sat at that table with my 2 hands and Nora's little recorder, and the particular clarity that arrives only when something you had half known your whole adult life finally becomes something you know completely. And I began to think, very carefully, about exactly what a man does when his own family tries to build a company on top of his name without asking, and what it costs them when he decides, quietly and without a single raised voice, to take that name back. Frank Del Vecchio had been coming to that house since before Ethan was born. He'd run site crews with me for 18 years, before he moved into project management, and in 30-plus years of friendship I had never once shown up at his door without finding coffee already made, the way you stop remarking on the sun coming up. He arrived at 8 the next morning with 2 coffees in a cardboard tray, and the particular quiet of a man who has already guessed the shape of bad news and is bracing for the details. I played him the recording at my kitchen table. He listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, completely still, mug in both hands, eyes on the middle distance. When it finished, he set his coffee down very carefully, as if the table might not hold the weight of what he was about to say. "They forged your signature on an LLC amendment," he said. "That's not a civil matter, Walter. In Ohio, that's felony-level forgery and fraud, especially if there's a bank loan attached to it. You're not filing a lawsuit, you're filing a police report and a bar complaint, because if a licensed professional's involved in drafting or notarizing that paperwork, that's their license on the line too." "I want it done right," I said, "not fast." "Right." Frank nodded once, the way he always did when a plan had been agreed on and there was no further need to discuss it, and pulled out his phone to call Carol Simmons, a business litigation attorney out of Columbus, who'd handled a contract dispute for him years back and, according to Frank, did not lose the cases she chose to take. Carol's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a lobby that smelled like money and eucalyptus. She was a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from having heard a great many terrible things calmly. She listened to the recording twice. She read through the documents Frank and I had pulled from the county recorder's office that morning, the LLC amendment filing, dated in October, my signature on it too straight, too even, missing the slight leftward lean mine had carried since I broke that finger in 91. "This signature is not yours," she said, without a question mark. "No," I said. "And the Delaware Avenue property?" "Still in my name," I said, "for now." "Then we move on 2 tracks," Carol said, capping her pen. The forgery and fraudulent LLC filing go to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office with the recording as supporting evidence. That's criminal, and it runs on its own schedule, separate from you. And on the civil side, we file to void the LLC amendment and confirm your sole ownership of Hensley Construction, effective immediately. If Richard Colton attempted to use that entity as collateral for any loan application, we notify the lending institution in writing the moment we have confirmation. Banks take unauthorized signatory fraud very seriously. It ends financing conversations fast. How fast? Frank asked. Days, not weeks, Carol said. Especially once we send formal notice. I thought about that for a moment, turning my coffee cup slowly in both hands. There's something else, I said. A trust. For Nora. Carol looked up. Not tied to any of this, I said. Something that can't be touched by whatever happens next in that family. A 529 education account, held with a custodian who isn't part of the Colton household. Structured so the custodianship can't be changed without a judge signing off. She's your granddaughter, Carol said. That's straightforward enough. I want it funded enough that it matters, I said, no matter what happens to anyone else's finances. Carol wrote for a while without speaking. Then she looked up. Anything else? I thought about Margaret's watercolor hanging crooked on my kitchen wall, about the cherry wood box I still hadn't decided what to build, about a life I had spent 41 years constructing for other people that had never once had my own name carved into the foundation of it. Not today, I said, but there will be. The days between that meeting and the new year passed in a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. Not peaceful exactly, but purposeful, the particular stillness of a man in the middle of deciding something large. Carol's office sent formal notice to First Heritage Bank on December 3rd, confirming that any application involving Hensley Construction or the newly filed entity Colton Hensley Development had proceeded without authorization from the sole legal owner of record. The bank's loan officer, according to a call Carol received 2 days later, had already begun asking Richard's attorney some very pointed questions about signatory authority. On December 9th, Frank drove out to the county recorder's office with me, and we filed the paperwork voiding the LLC amendment. My name, Hensley Construction, sole proprietor, restored, clean, in writing, permanent. I stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the cold December light and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since Thanksgiving. Ethan called twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. I wasn't avoiding him out of spite. I simply didn't yet have anything to say that wouldn't come out sharper than I wanted it to. And Margaret had always told me that the words you regret are the ones you say before you're ready to say them carefully. It was Frank who told me, on the morning of December 14th, what had happened at First Heritage Bank 3 days earlier. He'd heard it secondhand from a loan officer's assistant who happened to be married to a man on Frank's old crew, the way news in a small enough town always finds its way home eventually. Richard had gone in to finalize financing on a mixed-use retail development outside Dublin, Ohio, 7 figures, using Colton Hensley Development as the credit anchoring entity, listing 41 years of Hensley Construction's clean project history as collateral for the loan's underwriting. The loan officer had pulled the ownership records as standard procedure. Found the amendment voided. Found the notice from Carol's office already sitting in the file, formal and unambiguous. The loan was frozen within the hour. Richard's attorney called the bank twice that afternoon, according to Frank's source, and both calls ended with the same answer: no further credit extension without a legitimate, verified signatory. He walked out of that meeting, Frank told me over the phone, already dialing his attorney in the parking lot. Apparently didn't even wait to get to his car. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt something quieter and colder. The specific weight of watching a consequence land that I had set in motion and could no longer call back, even if I'd wanted to. It was the right consequence. It was still not an easy thing to hear. 2 days after that, on a Tuesday evening just after 6, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Hensley? A woman's voice, careful. The particular tension of someone who has rehearsed what she's about to say and still isn't certain she's going to get through it. My name is Louisa Fenn. I've worked for the Colton family for almost 9 years. I hope you'll forgive me calling out of nowhere like this." "I'm listening, Mrs. Fenn," I said. "What happened at that dinner?" she said. "And what I understand's been happening with the paperwork. I have things you should see. I made copies 6 months ago. I didn't know what to do with them, and I didn't know who to trust with them, so I just kept them, waiting, I suppose, for the right moment." "Why now?" I asked, though I already had a guess forming. The pause that followed wasn't evasive. It was the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth to give. "My son runs his own framing crew out of Grove City," she said finally. 9 years now, good reputation, hard working. Mr. Colton met him at a site walkthrough last spring. Didn't know he was my son. Told him, in front of 5 other men, that men like him just move lumber. They don't build anything that matters. Her voice steadied. I went home that night and made copies of everything on my desk I'd been uneasy about for a year. I've been waiting for someone who deserved to see them. "What do you have?" I asked. "Bank correspondence between Mr. Colton and his attorney about the LLC restructuring, going back 8 months. A copy of the property document your daughter-in-law's father had drawn up for the Delaware Avenue parcel. Not a transfer yet, but the groundwork for one, dated for after your passing, structured as an inheritance override naming Colton Hensley as beneficiary instead of your son. And," she paused, "internal emails discussing how to keep Ethan from finding out the full scope of it until it was already done." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same chair I'd been sitting in the night I first pressed play on Nora's recorder. "Send me everything you have, Mrs. Fenn," I said. "Whatever it costs you, I'll make sure it doesn't cost you your job." "It's already too late to worry about that," she said, not unkindly. "I gave my notice this morning. I've been at that house 9 years, Mr. Hensley. I've held a lot of things I didn't like the shape of. This was the last one I was willing to carry." Her documents arrived by email the next morning. 14 scanned pages, organized by date, labeled in the careful handwriting of a woman who understood that evidence was only useful if someone else could follow the thread of it. Frank and I spread them across his kitchen table that afternoon and went through every page twice, the way we used to review blueprints before the first nail went into a job. What Louisa had sent confirmed everything the recording had suggested, and added a layer I hadn't expected: the inheritance override. Structured months before Thanksgiving, drafted with the clear intention of routing Hensley Construction's assets and the Delaware Avenue property into Colton Hensley Development upon my death, bypassing Ethan entirely as beneficiary in favor of the jointly held entity his father-in-law controlled. They hadn't just been planning to use my name while I was alive. They'd been planning what to do with everything I'd built after I was gone, and they'd been planning it without my son's knowledge, which told me something about how little Richard Colton actually thought of Ethan, too. A detail that, later, would matter more than I expected it to. I carried that discovery to Carol's office on December 20th, 4 days before Christmas. She read through everything without speaking, the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating the size of a problem in real time. "This isn't just fraud anymore," she said finally. "This is estate fraud in the planning stages, alongside forgery, alongside unauthorized use of a business entity for loan collateral. I'd strongly recommend the prosecutor's office treat this as a pattern, not an isolated incident." She looked up at me over her glasses. "Mr. Hensley, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want to pursue everything available to you here? Because what's available to you here is substantial." I thought about the folding chair by the kitchen door. I thought about the music box in the wastebasket, about Margaret's photograph disappearing into the crowd on a tray of dirty glasses, about Nora's small, furious voice I hadn't been able to make out over my own footsteps leaving that house. "Yes," I said, "but I want to do one more thing first. Something that isn't about punishment." Carol set her pen down. "Go on." "I want to set up the trust for Nora before anything else moves forward," I said. "I want it done, funded, and irreversible before Christmas. Whatever happens to her parents' marriage, whatever happens to her grandfather's business, I want that girl to have something in her name that nobody in that house can touch or take back or use as leverage against anyone. Ever." Carol looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that told me she'd represented a great many people chasing revenge, and had learned to recognize, by contrast, when someone was chasing something else entirely. I can have the account structured and funded by December 23rd, she said. Custodian named, judicial oversight clause in place, fully irrevocable. Name Louisa Fenn as custodian, I said. Not anyone in the Colton or Hensley family. Someone with nothing to gain and nothing to protect except that little girl. Carol wrote it down without further comment, the same way she'd written down everything else that afternoon, and I walked out of her office into the cold Columbus evening feeling, for the first time since Thanksgiving, that I finally understood the full shape of the third option I'd started building in my head, the night I first pressed play on a dead little girl's recorder and heard my own family's plans for the rest of my life laid out in two calm, unhurried voices. Christmas Eve, I spent alone in the house on Delaware Avenue, and it was, strangely, one of the most peaceful evenings I'd had in 3 years. I built a fire. I sat with Margaret's watercolor, and a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands, and I thought about the cherry wood I'd bought back in November, before any of this started, intending to build Nora a proper jewelry box for her 8th birthday. I hadn't touched it since. I decided, sitting there in the firelight, exactly what I was going to build with it instead, and exactly what was going to go inside. Ethan called at 9 that night. I let it go to voicemail again, and this time I listened to what he left. "Dad," his voice said, rough in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. "Vanessa's dad is saying things about you I don't know what's true anymore. Please call me back. Please." I did not call him back that night. Some conversations I had learned from Margaret are only worth having once you know exactly what you're going to say, and I still had 2 more things to build before I was ready to say any of it. The first was the trust. Carol confirmed it, funded and irrevocable on December 23rd, exactly as promised. Louisa Fenn named custodian, judicial oversight in place, untouchable by anyone but a court and a little girl old enough, eventually, to decide what to do with it herself. The second was the box. I cut the cherry wood boards on the morning of December 27th, jointed the edges by hand, glued the corners, and left it clamped overnight the way you leave anything that needs time to set properly before it can hold weight. In the morning I fit the lid, cut the hinge mortises with a chisel, set the brass hardware, and sanded the whole thing through 80 grit, then 120, then 220, finishing by hand along the grain, the way Margaret always said mattered more than people gave it credit for. Into the lid, I carved her name. Not printed, her actual signature, the shape of it I'd watched her sign on 39 years of birthday cards and grocery lists, and the backs of photographs she insisted on labeling before she could ever forget what was in them. I had it memorized without ever having tried to. Inside the box, I placed 3 things. Our wedding photograph from 1979, rice still caught in her hair, both of us barely older than Ethan was now. Her wedding ring, wrapped in the same square of white flannel I'd kept it in since the hospital, and a flash drive, holding a video I recorded that same evening at the kitchen table. 1 candle, no script, because I had tried writing one and thrown it away. It sounded like a man performing a version of himself he thought the occasion required, and Margaret never had patience for performance. I sat down in front of the camera and I talked to my son. "Ethan, if you're watching this, you've found the box, and that means some time has passed, and I hope by now you've had a chance to think clearly about what's happened. I'm not leaving because I'm angry. I was angry, and it passed the way anger does when you let it. I'm leaving because I heard something in your voice on that driveway that told me I had become a problem you were managing, instead of a father you were willing to defend, and a man shouldn't have to be that to his own son, not if he has any say in the matter. I know what Richard was planning to do with everything I built. I know it's in writing, in his own hand, and his lawyers. What I don't know, and what I need you to think hard about, is how much of it you knew and chose not to see, and how much of it was simply kept from you the way it was kept from me. I've left that question with you, because it isn't mine to answer for you. The house on Delaware Avenue is yours if you want it, once everything with the county is settled. The company is being restructured. Frank Del Vecchio will run it going forward, and I've left instructions for how you can be part of that, if you want to be, on terms that don't run through anyone else's family. There's a trust for Nora that no one, including you, can touch or redirect. That was never negotiable, and I hope you understand why. Whatever you decide to do next, whatever kind of man you decide to be when nobody's managing you, and there's no father-in-law watching to see how you perform, I hope you choose the real one. Your mother always did. It made her the finest person I ever knew, and some days, son, I still catch myself trying to live up to what she expected of both of us. I saved the file, sealed the box, and set it in the center of the kitchen table on the morning of December 30th. Between two place settings I hadn't cleared away in 3 years because clearing them had always felt like giving up something I wasn't ready to give up. This time I understood, finally, that I was. Frank picked me up before dawn on New Year's Day. I'd packed one duffel bag, the same green canvas one I'd carried to job sites since 1994, zipper pull replaced twice, a black thread repair on the shoulder strap that never quite matched the original. That was all I took. Frank looked at it in the trunk, looked at me, and didn't ask the question his face was clearly asking. "That's all you need?" he said instead. "That's all I need," I said. We drove through the dark toward the airport with the radio low on a news station neither of us was really listening to. The particular comfortable silence of two men who had run out of things they needed to say to each other and found something better waiting on the other side of it. I had a one-way ticket to Savannah, Georgia, booked 11 days earlier. The morning after I'd sat at Carol's office with the yellow legal pad and watched myself decide, one line at a time, how the rest of my life was going to be redirected. Margaret had wanted to see the Georgia coast for years. She'd torn a page out of a magazine in a dentist's waiting room once, a photograph of Spanish moss hanging over a quiet marsh at sunrise, and kept it in her purse for months. We never went. The diagnosis came, and then there were no more Somme days left to spend. I wasn't going as a symbolic gesture. I was going because I was 66 years old, because I had spent 41 years building things for other people, and because it seemed, finally, reasonable to build something for myself. Before I boarded, I sent Ethan one text. It took me 4 tries to get the words right, because the thing about a message that matters is that it should only be as long as the truth actually requires. I found the third option, Ethan. I hope one day you find yours. Dad, the phone rang 30 seconds later. I looked at his name on the screen, his contact photo, one I'd taken at his college graduation, both of us laughing at something Margaret had said behind the camera. And I let it ring 4 times before I turned the phone face down on my knee. It stopped. A voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen to it before I boarded. Frank called me on my 5th morning in Savannah. I was sitting on the dock of a small rented cottage on the marsh, coffee going cold in my hand, watching a heron work the shallows with the kind of patience I was only just beginning to understand. "Richard went back to First Heritage on January 6th, Frank said. Tried to push the Dublin development through using a different entity, cutting Hensley Construction's project history out of the underwriting entirely. Bank still flagged it. Apparently word travels fast in commercial lending circles when a developer's had one fraud notice filed against him already. They declined outright this time. No further discussion. I watched the heron lift off the water in one clean, unhurried motion. And the criminal complaint? Prosecutor's office opened a formal file January 9th, Frank said. Louise's documentation plus the recording. Carol says it's about as clean a case as she's seen. Forgery, unauthorized use of a business entity, and now they're looking at the estate fraud angle too, given the inheritance override paperwork. Could take months to move through, but it's moving. 2 weeks later, Carol called with an update of her own. Richard's contractor's license. The general contractor credential he held personally, separate from the corporate entity, had been flagged for review by the state licensing board after the fraud complaint became part of the public record. A commercial developer who'd built his reputation partly on that license found himself, for the first time in a 22-year career, unable to bid on new municipal contracts while the review was pending. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt the same quiet, cold weight I'd felt watching the bank freeze his loan. The specific gravity of consequences arriving exactly where they'd been aimed, and the understanding that watching them land is never quite as satisfying as people imagine it will be. Louisa Fenn called in February. She'd found new work managing a bed and breakfast in Grove City, closer to her son, and she called mostly, she said, because she thought I should know how things were unfolding in the house she'd left behind. Vanessa found out about the property override in January, she told me. Not from her father, from her own attorney, when she started asking questions about the marriage after everything with the bank came apart. She wasn't part of it. Mr. Hensley, whatever her father was planning, he never told her the full scope of it either. How's Ethan? I asked. Quiet, Louisa said. But I hear he moved into a rental in February. Filed for separation from Vanessa in March, not out of anger at her, from what I understand, but because he said he couldn't keep living inside a family that had planned to take everything from his own father without telling him. He's working for Frank now, I hear. Framing crew. I hadn't known that. Frank confirmed it 2 days later, almost embarrassed to have kept it from me. He showed up in February, Frank said. Didn't ask for anything. Asked if there was a spot on a crew. I put him on framing, same as anyone else starting out. He's good with his hands, Walter. Better than I expected. He's your grandson, I said, before catching my own mistake and laughing. The first real laugh I'd had in months. Your godson. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, Frank said, and I could hear him smiling on the other end of the line. By April, I'd found what would become Hensley Boat Works. A converted shrimping shed on the working side of the Savannah waterfront, corrugated roof, concrete floor worn smooth by 40 years of salt and foot traffic. Owned by a man named Otis Grant, who was 73 and finally ready to stop. We negotiated over 3 mornings at the counter of a coffee shop, 2 doors down, the way 2 men who understand the value of things negotiate, plainly, without pretense, and shook hands on a number we both found fair. It was the first time my name had gone up on a building in 4 decades, without someone else's name attached above it. The work was the same work. Underneath the surface differences. Measure twice, don't rush the joint, trust the material to tell you what it needs. I restored my first boat that spring, a battered wooden skiff a local fisherman had all but given up on. And by summer I had 2 more waiting in the queue, and a granddaughter's laugh occasionally in my head reminding me why any of it mattered. Nora called me for the first time in May, using Louisa's phone, since her own parents' situation was still working itself out through lawyers and careful custody arrangements. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, but steady. Grandpa Walter, she said. Mrs. Louisa said you have a boat shop now. I do, I said, building things again, real things this time, not just for the yard. Did they fix the music box? She asked, and something in my chest cracked open, quiet and total. I found it, in the trash bin. I got it out before anyone saw. It doesn't play right anymore, but I still wind it. We'll fix it together, I said. When you visit, I promise you that. She visited in July with Ethan. On the first trip, the custody arrangement allowed, once the separation proceedings had settled enough for travel. My son stood at the edge of my dock in the Georgia heat, thinner than I remembered, quieter, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I read the letter, he said finally. The one in the box. I've read it probably 20 times. And I didn't know the full scope of what Richard was planning, he said. But I knew enough to be uncomfortable, and I let Vanessa talk me past the discomfort every time, because it was easier than fighting for you in a room full of people who'd already decided you didn't belong. That's on me, Dad, not on Richard. On me? I know, I said. You're standing here anyway. That counts for something. Nora was already halfway down the dock, shoes off, climbing onto the skiff I'd just finished restoring with the fearlessness only a child possesses, calling back to ask what the boat's name was going to be. I looked at my son and passed him at the marsh grass moving gold in the July light, and I thought about a woman who used to say a home isn't the walls, it's the decisions made inside them, and I understood, finally, standing on a dock 1,000 miles from the driveway where all of this began, that some decisions take longer to build than others, but they hold, in the end, exactly as well as you make them. Margaret, I said. The boat's name is Margaret. Nora clapped both hands over her mouth, delighted, and started asking when we could take her out on the water, and Ethan laughed. A real one. Sudden and unguarded, the kind that arrives without warning and takes over a person's whole body the way his mother's laugh always had. I did not look back toward the driveway in Upper Arlington. Not that day, not since. I had told my son once that a family built on quiet erasures eventually collapses under its own weight, and that a man's worth was never something another family's dinner table had the right to decide. I hadn't gotten even. I had gotten honest, slowly, carefully, over the better part of a year, and honesty, it turned out, held up a great deal better than revenge ever could have. If you've ever been the one seated by the kitchen door while the family that mattered laughed at the head of the table, if you've ever chosen the quiet third option instead of the apology someone else demanded of you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every one. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need to hear that leaving quietly is sometimes the loudest thing a man can do. This story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling purposes. The names and places are imagined, but everything it's trying to say to you is worth hearing.